I tried phoning the office at the archives a couple of times in the morning to speak to somebody about it, but nobody answered me. I let it go as far as the beat for the voicemail before hanging up. I hate the thought of my voice being recorded for anybody to hear.
If it were the case that everyone was negative about dialects and really didn't like them, people would stop using dialect. And what do we see across the United Kingdom? It's like a linguistic dialect Disney World.
Says you wouldn't believed, you just will not believe.
Oh, yeah, rocket, it means go away, you idiot, or go away, you bam.
Shabn's a good name, which is cow poo.
Vitally, I don't know, give another dichty with my penny.
A handful of work, and I had to go and look at Scots dictionary just to make sure it had got the right word.
Some people might say on the surface, oh, my dialect, oh, I'm so embarrassed about my dialect, I don't like my dialect at all, blah, 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 blah. But really underneath, they might be secretly proud of the dialect.
Professor Jennifer Smith specialises in sociolinguistics, the study of how society affects language. She's done research on some Scottish dialects, or the regional variations of a language. She's based at Glasgow University, in a city well known for its distinctive accent and dialect.
Everyone mocks the Glasgow dialect. It's the worst dialect ever. It's from the gutter, etc., etc. However, Glaswegian speakers themselves, you go out in the streets of Glasgow, what do you hear? Strong Glasgow dialect. So there must be a lot of, actual pride in order to keep that dialect going.
My pal's got a really big, long ginger beard, and he was standing at a bus stop once, and some guy, JK guy, that's a Glaswegian word I think, just shouted over him, "Ho! Ginger Santa! He's a fag!" Which is quite funny.
Mark Fraser is a 29-year-old writer who's lived in Glasgow all his life. Many of the stories he writes are set in his hometown, often with characters speaking Glaswegian. But he thinks writers too often misuse dialect to stereotype working-class people, something he wants to avoid.
For me, it goes as far back as Walter Scott, who are the people, the Highlanders in Waverley, who are like the lower class, and the Jacobites, their dialect is preserved. The Highland dialect is preserved, whereas people who are from Edinburgh, for example, they're written speaking proper English, all the books in proper English. So I made a choice to not have characters who are working class speaking slang, because that happens, that exists. You meet them all the time. Do you ever actually have to even seriously contemplate this idea that I'm tied down to being a certain kind of person to the way that I speak? Maybe Victorian England would have had you thought that, but I don't think so anymore.
Postgraduate student Rosie McCaffrey has just completed her course in creative writing. Like Mark, she's a born and bred Glaswegian.
To outsiders, it's a very non-inclusive thing. People always talk about when they come here, it's a really difficult accent or dialect to understand. And I think it can be a good thing. It can kind of contribute to this sense of like a city community identity.
But unlike Mark, Rosie doesn't choose to write in the dialect. She doesn't even speak it. She says this can be a barrier with other young people in the city, something she remembers well from her school days.
It was a weird kind of tribal thing, like you felt like if one of your friends who used to speak the way that you did suddenly spoke slang, you were kind of losing them to the other side. If you speak quite properly, they think that you are entitled or pretentious, or that you're being patronising, or you're speaking down to them. And they play to that attitude. I think they kind of almost dumb themselves down.
But for Mark, social division is never a problem. He'll change the way he speaks depending on who he's talking to.
Automatically it just changes, it's never a conscious decision. I think we all do that, whether we like it or not, whether we notice it or not. We all talk differently around different people, no matter where you're from. So I would probably talk more like with Mary slang, maybe talking a wee bit more, a wee bit more aggressive. It sounds more aggressive, you know what I mean? And probably say you know what I mean a lot, because it's punctuation.
In sociolinguistics, Professor Smith says this unconscious shift is known as bidialectalism.
It's this idea that people have two separate, distinct dialects. So it used to be in the past, if you went up to somewhere like Buckie or Wick or somewhere in the northwest coast, and you spoke to older speakers in those areas, what you might have found is that those speakers had one way of speaking, and that was their dialect, that was their home dialect. But people reckon now that in today's very globalised world, where we're all exposed to lots of different dialects, exposed to a lot of television, people think that there's no such thing now as a monodialectal speaker, a speaker that can only speak in dialect.
Say to me, come away and Clemens, who's this the other day? They keep on fine thanks, clever your news that do not give you a hate.
From memory, Clem Watson speaks in the dialect that was still widely spoken 70 years ago in the small fishing village of Cromarty, north of Inverness. As the fishing industry declined, it fell out of use with the locals, and the last fluent speaker, Bobby Hogg, passed away in 2012. Clem says Bobby and his brother Gordon would speak in both Standard English and their native dialect.
They had the ability to switch pretty quickly, but it was like, if you didn't want somebody else to know what you're talking about, they would soon speed up the local dialect right away and get the other person lost if they didn't want to share the information.
But for the children who spoke in the dialect, there wasn't always a choice.
They would have the accent until they really hit the school gate, and then after that, in the playground all right, but once you went into the classroom you were taught how now brown cow type of English. You were dissuaded from using it because it wasn't proper. And now, as time goes on, we're interested in our own language and dialect and what the sort of contribution it made to the sort of social influence of the area.
75 miles along the coast in Moray is the fishing town of Buckie, Professor Smith's hometown. Here they speak another dialect altogether, but unlike in Cromarty, the Doric dialect is still widely spoken.
You can tell that people are really positive towards it because it's not suffering rapid attrition. You know, the young speakers still sound distinctly Buckie.
And argued that back in the old days when whaling was a done thing round the coast of Peterhead, his ancestors would have been happy enough to harpoon.
The same can still be said for other young speakers from towns on the northeast coast. Shane Strachan grew up speaking Doric in Fraserburgh and has just graduated with a PhD in creative writing.
It can be frustrating as well, sending stories to magazines and them saying they really enjoyed it, they really liked it, but they're worried the readership won't get it. And that's where the crux comes in about really how open are people to works that aren't in standard English.
Much of Shane's work is inspired by the declining fishing industry, something he sees affecting the Doric dialect, even in the small age gap between him and his younger cousins.
When they were being brought up, my parents, my aunties and uncles started speaking to them in standard English, and I felt very strange that they were being treated differently from the way I was being treated. But I think that was around the time that the fishing industry was in decline, and there was an awareness of, we kind of have to look outside of the area for industry, for jobs, and it kind of was more of a push then to go to university and to speak standard.
This is a view shared by 87-year-old Margaret. She's lived in the northeast of Scotland all her life, and she thinks the rise of the oil and gas industries in Aberdeen has had an irreversible effect on the chances of Doric survival.
I think it will eventually die out. I think it's bound to happen because it was just an influx of English folk in when the oil and the gas started. And that was the start of the folks started to speak more English to be understood, I suppose.
Her son, Ian, has worked in the oil industry in Aberdeen for 40 years, but he says it's changing technology that plays the biggest role in the change in Doric.
My generation was the first generation that was exposed to TV. It didn't really affect us too much, although our accent was different to our parents, but it wasn't that dramatically different. But later generations after me were heavily influenced. Everything from Neighbours to EastEnders, just a tsunami of TV.
The spread of modern technology, the fall of the fishing industry, the rise of oil and gas. In 100 years' time, will Doric disappear completely?
I'm sure it'll still exist in some form, some variant, but I hope it's not just a sort of academic subject like Latin became. Essentially, I hope it is something that still exists because people need to use it, and it still means something culturally, but who knows?
No one can say with 100% certainty what the future holds for Scottish dialects. Language, by its very nature, is fluid and unpredictable in all its forms. But for now, this unique part of our heritage continues to delight, baffle and enthrall, whether or not you speak it.
There's so many kind of different colourful expressions that you don't get in standard English.
Roaster's just like an idiot, a buffoon. That guy's a pure roaster.
Verfochen means I'm just done, tired, cleaned in.
If it defines a place is its language, then anybody for that place, when they hear that language, for their place, they have an immediate affinity with that person.
It goes to the very fabric of who we are, what we think about ourselves, what we think about other people. It absolutely pervades every aspect of life. you cannot fail but be interested in it.